My name's Dr. Martin Koyabe. I am a Kenyan based here in the diaspora in the United Kingdom. I am also a diaspora leader involved in a number of working groups both in the UK, Europe, and also in Kenya. I was also privileged to have an opportunity to provide input from the diaspora towards the development of the Kenya Diaspora Policy 2024. Before I make my remarks, allow me to also thank the Foreign and Diaspora Affairs Ministry, led by Honorable Dr. Musalia Mudavadi, who is also the Prime Cabinet Secretary, assisted, of course, by the PS, Rosalind Jogu, and PS, Dr. Singoei. I would also want to thank the staff of the State Department of Diaspora Affairs, who have indeed worked very hard to ensure that this document sees the light of the day. I do have a number of comments, but before that, allow me to give a short perspective of what this document means to the diasporans and how the aspirations of the diasporans have been included into this particular document. Initially, during the formation of the State Department of Diaspora Affairs, and when I say we, some of us were involved in providing some input on how this State Department would work and what are the functions and areas of intervention that the State Department would be looking at. There were three areas that we had proposed at the beginning, and these included the inclusion of diaspora in the political process and the governance of the government in Kenya. The idea here was, how do we make sure that diaspora was fully involved, especially in the political process, and participates in the governance at various levels in the country so that we can be able to participate and contribute. The second issue was the issue around investments, savings, and how we were meant to transfer technology and innovation and expertise and experience from the diaspora into Kenya so that the country Kenya can benefit fully. And then thirdly was the issue around the socio-economic issues, covering culture, issues such as funerals, issues such as bereavement, and emergencies that do face Kenyans and any other diasporians around the world. These three areas were very critical in terms of addressing aspirational issues that the diaspora had at the time. During the formulation of this particular policy, we then contributed by providing three specific factors that are very fundamental when it comes to a diaspora policy. The first is the issue around ensuring that we address the issues of participation and bringing in the value add that diasporians bring in, including experience, including the expertise that the diaspora bring, and also the networks that the diaspora have when they contribute towards the country. The second contribution was the area of investment. When you look at the remittance of diasporians, especially in Kenya, the remittance have increased year on, year after. And therefore, the capital value that the diasporans are contributing towards the economy of Kenya would become a critical factor in terms of making sure that the policy tries to leverage the dividends that have been contributed by the diasporans when it comes to remittance. The third issue was the cultural and the diaspora diplomacy, which has been covered as well in the foreign policy document that is being debated and being reviewed at the moment, that looks at the diaspora as a value add when it comes to issues of diplomacy, culture, and also exchange of ideas between different countries around the world with Kenya. These three issues, including the aspirations that I talked about, have all been inculcated into this particular policy document, as we shall see shortly. Allow me to make a few comments on specific areas of the policy, which I believe you've all had a chance to look at, but I will just emphasize on the importance of these particular areas when it comes to the perspective of the diaspora. The first aspect and action that has been taken is the area around the rights, the welfare, and the interest of Kenyans in the diaspora. There are two specific areas that have been covered. In this case, we see that the policy itself addresses the issue of a comprehensive Kenya diaspora database. It is important to remember that collection of information has its responsibility. At the same time, it is also important to give some incentive so that the diasporans can provide this information, update this information to enable the country, or Kenya for that matter, to be able to address diaspora issues effectively. So incentivization of contribution of diaspora data becomes critical. The safety of that data and also following the data protection that bounds diasporians to contribute or to give this data should be understood very clearly. The second issue around this intervention is the issue around developing a process that can enable diasporians to address distress calls, and this is something that has been addressed by the State Department. We've seen cases such as in Lebanon and as also in Saudi Arabia, or actually in the Arab states, where distress calls have been addressed. Very, very recently, we are seeing cases in Vietnam where there are some specific cases that have arisen where diasporians, or Kenyans for that matter, in Vietnam require some assistance. And I think the State Department has been handling this in a way that is almost aligned with what the policy document aspires to establish. There are aspects such as retirement and other benefits that need to be looked at, especially when you transfer your benefits from your diaspora location back to the country. That facilitation will be very important. The second aspect that I wanted to comment on is what the diaspora policy refers to as diaspora savings, investments, remittance, and technology transfer. And in particular, there are 2 points here that I wanted to highlight, which refers to the promotion of the transfer of diaspora knowledge, skills, innovation, and also technology. It's very, very, very important that we highlight and the policy addresses the issue of emerging technology. Emerging technology is going quite fast, and it's important that the country leverages on the knowledge base that has been created in the diaspora in order to allow that knowledge to be transferred adequately and effectively into the country. There are methods to do that, and this is something that we shall be discussing probably with the State Department in future as we look at this area. Use of ICT cannot be debated. And I think the policy document makes it very clear that they will try and use ICT services or ICT technology in order to provide diaspora services. But in particular, we want to make sure that the policy is data-driven. It has to use the technology in order to collect appropriate data so that we can be able to apportion specific resources that are required in various locations. We can be able to make specific decisions when it comes to allocation of specific priority resources or technology into the embassies. Within our State Department thoughts of how this could be able to be leveraged, we actually looked at technology as a key pillar that should be embedded in most of our embassies or missions for that matter, in order to provide adequate service for Kenyans. And a case in mind is an example of when COVID hit the whole world. There was a question of how could voting and other services continue in the embassy, and therefore the need for technology becomes almost a must to this particular policy as it addresses some of these issues. The 2 last points that I wanted to point out is the area of partnerships and engagement with the Kenya diaspora. And 2 specific aspects that have been pointed is the establishment of a framework for partnership and engagement between the diaspora and the county governments. And I think this is a very noble idea. And I would actually argue that this will spur what I called the micro and nano investments by the diaspora directly into the counties. And this is something which is really welcome. The other aspect is the facilitation of the establishment of what we call the Diaspora Summit. The idea of the Diaspora Summit is very important. There's been an argument of how does the Diaspora State Department, or the government for that matter, interact with the diaspora without necessarily being politically one-sided and being, of course, an interaction that is open, that is not biased based on who in the diaspora is interacting with the State Department. Having a summit is good and it's inspirational and it's welcome. However, there are some specific areas that need to be clarified. For example, there is a need to delimit and to be able to create the actual boundaries of representation. At the moment, we have diaspora being referred as County 48, diaspora also being referred as Constituency 291. The Constituency 291 will require some wards to be established. And in that case, those wards will be able to elect their leaders so that those leaders can be able to participate, whether it's in the summit directly or indirectly or through other regional leaders, so that the summit can have a clear, open, transparent, and even what we call inclusive representation of the diaspora. So that is a question to be looked at some point. There is also the question around the budgetary. How will this summit be maintained? How will this summit be sustainable in the longer term? So that is something that I believe the policy needs to address as we continue with this particular process. And then lastly, on the part of international jobs, the key is not only to export talent that Kenya has internationally, but is to have a symmetric association where diasporians are also encouraged to create employment for Kenyans in the country. Exporting of knowledge to the outside world is useful because it gives Kenyans the ability to learn new technology. So take, for example, if Kenyans go and learn how to be a bus driver or a mechanic in Germany, what that means is that that Kenyan will come back with the knowledge of that technology in Germany. But if the country does not have similar technology that this diasporian can be able to use in what we have established in the country, then you find that symmetry doesn't match. The same applies to areas such as emerging technology, where the diasporians have gathered a lot of experience in emerging technology or automated technology, but when they come back home, they find that is a problem. So we really need to look at this holistically, especially when it comes to the areas of improving the curriculum. I know of automotive engineers in Kenya still understanding the engines of a Peugeot, while right now, if you ask the French, they'll talk of different cars which are actually being driven on the roads in France. The same applies in other areas of intervention, whether it's agriculture, whether it's medicine, whether it's even business processing, and other aspects that we've seen today. We are also seeing a plethora of what we call the gig economy of Kenyans creating content, putting content out there that is very, very important for them. And there's a very huge stream of revenue that is coming through content creation. And the content creation requires the data to be at least relevant to whom you are creating the content for. So I think the idea around looking at the symmetry of how we create these jobs is very important. And I'm sure the global labor market strategy will be able to address that. And then finally, I had a comment on the issue of implementation. And as I said earlier, one of the challenges that I see is the implementation of the Diaspora Summit. Having said that, it's a good direction for this particular policy document to address that issue because the interface between the diaspora and the Kenya government, or the State Department for that matter, is still very fundamental. And then finally is just a few what we call take-home comments that I would like this really to be taken at heart, because these are the areas that I think will be able to make sure that this particular policy sees the light of day, but also does what it says on the tin. For example, the engagement with the diaspora cannot be emphasized more than what it has been emphasized in this particular document. And I think that's a very good thing that we need to look at. So that engagement should be a very key factor that needs to be established in a more open, transparent, and more easier to understand way that can be inclusive to diasporians. The second issue is the issue around the participation, both at the political and also governance in the country. We need to look at laws, especially in the Constitution, that do inhibit that participation, especially when it comes to specific levels of responsibility. Dual citizens should be encouraged to take up these particular responsibilities because they bring the value add as we know it today. So therefore, looking at the political and the area around governance is important. In politics, we've already proposed in a different stream of work that we are looking at expanding the polling stations in the diaspora. If you take, for example, last year or in the last election process, we had roughly about 12 countries participating in the election of the presidency. These 12 countries, we only had roughly about 19 missions that belongs to the Kenya government that were used as points of polling centers during that election. We feel that this is not enough. We need to increase the number of polling stations or polling centers for that matter. We need to increase the wards because wards were actually allocated to countries. If you take, for example, the IOM data that looks at the migration of Kenyans into the diaspora, you would find that the US is actually the leading, followed by the UK, and then various other countries follow through. We are recommending, for example, that the US should increase the number of polling stations, especially in states such as Atlanta, Minnesota, Texas, and also in Washington, in Seattle, where we need at least a polling center to be established. In other areas such as Australia, we are seeing a lot of migration into Australia. We are also seeing a lot of migration into Canada. We are seeing a lot of migration into Europe, in specific areas of Europe, and we are recommending Spain to have at least a polling station. We are recommending Riyadh to have a polling station because we are seeing a lot of migration into the Arab states. We are even recommending a polling station in Mozambique because it has a very high level of Kenyans who have actually congregated in that area. South Africa requires an addition of a polling station so that the South African region can be able to vote adequately. So is the North, especially in an area such as Egypt and Senegal, where we've identified the need for that. And not forgetting India and China. So these are areas where we believe that polling stations need to be put in so that they can be able to balance the way the diaspora works. We've also looked at Europe, and in Europe, we have proposed Spain, Germany, increase in the UK, and also in Austria. And therefore, within the Scandinavian, we are looking at Sweden to have a polling station so that the Scandinavian countries, including Denmark, Finland, and other countries within the area, and Norway for also, should be able to congregate in either Stockholm or any city that is nearby in order to vote. So these are some of the areas that we think will be very important in doing that. And two last points is the issue of the budget. The State Department of Diaspora needs to have a budget that is commensurate with what this particular policy aspires to achieve. If the State Department does not get the budget that it needs, then it might be constrained in actually establishing what we are now looking at in front of us in the next 5 years or in the next 7 years or 10 years for that matter. Lastly, it's the issue around the political will. We are very thankful for the government the current government, and of course now the broad-based government that has actually been able to be very supportive. And through the dynamic leadership of the PS, we are very, very pleased and really blessed to have a ministry that has embraced the diaspora issues and taken them at heart, not only in the issues of day-to-day work, but also as a personal objective in order to push this forward. I'll stop there, but thank you so much for this opportunity. And I wish the ministry and the State Department and also the staff in the State Department all the best in ensuring that you can be able to establish and be able to implement this particular policy. Thank you very much.